he wanted to dominate. He at the end of the game, he knew every stat that he had. His records are hilarious. No one will come close to his records. When you're young, you don't understand that, but what he was doing was you can't rest on your laurels, son. You know, you got to be twice as good as those guys in order to get the job. So.
Walt Frazier named 5 NBA players who exploited him. Let me tell you exactly who they were and how they did it. Even the coolest defender in basketball history had opponents who could break through his armor. And these weren't just great players. They were perfect counters to everything Frazier built his reputation on. Each one attacked a different weakness, and by the end of their battles, Frazier had been dissected piece by piece. Frazier was the king of the steal. He didn't just guard you, he baited you. He stood with his legs wide and hands low, inviting the dribble, waiting for that split second when the ball left your hand. Then he'd strike like a cobra. This technique made him a 7-time all-defensive first-team selection. It earned him the nickname Clyde after the bank robber because he was stealing with such style. But this entire system relied on one thing: rhythm. Frazier studied the cadence of a dribble, the predictable thump-thump-thump against the hardwood. He timed his swipes to perfection. If you could break that rhythm, you could break Frazier. And 5 players did exactly that. Oscar Robertson broke Frazier with pure strength. When Frazier talks about the big O, he uses one phrase over and over: pound and pound. This wasn't just a description of dribbling, it was a description of trauma. Robertson stood 6'5" and weighed 220 pounds. He was a point guard in a power forward's body. He would turn his back to Frazier at the top of the key and dribble with his outside hand, using his massive hip and shoulder as a battering ram. Pound and pound, step by step, backing Frazier down until he was in the high post, 15 feet from the basket, where his one-handed jumper was unblockable. Frazier was 6'4" and strong for a guard, but he relied on agility and length. Robertson neutralized both. To steal the ball, Frazier had to reach around Robertson's body. Robertson would sense the reach and spin off the contact or draw a foul. If Frazier held his ground, Robertson just kept pounding. The mechanics of this matchup were brutal. Frazier had to lower his center of gravity, brace his core, and absorb the impact on every single possession. This constant wrestling match drained his legs, which affected his jump shot and his explosiveness in transition, and there was no rhythm to steal. Robertson moved at his own deliberate pace, immune to being sped up. He controlled the tempo with an iron grip, forcing the dynamic Knicks to play in the mud. The rivalry got worse when Robertson joined the Milwaukee Bucks and paired with Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Frazier had to deal with Robertson the scorer and Robertson the facilitator of the greatest center in the game. Robertson played with a sense of ownership and entitlement to his space. For Frazier, representing the structured system of the Knicks, facing the physically dominant Robertson was exhausting on every level. The pound was the sound of Frazier's defensive autonomy being eroded, dribble by dribble. Robertson was nearly impossible to stop once he established position, and Frazier admitted it. Jerry West exploited Frazier with precision. If Robertson was brute force, West was lethal accuracy. Frazier described West's game with 3 words: stop and pop. West could sprint at full speed and arrest his momentum instantly, elevating into a perfect jump shot. For a defender like Frazier, who prided himself on sticking to his man, West's deceleration was a nightmare. When you're chasing a ball handler at full speed, your momentum carries you backward. If the ball handler stops abruptly, your inertia carries you past the shooter. West mastered this mechanic. Frazier found that staying attached to West's lightning quick release was exhausting because it required constant micro adjustments and emergency braking. But the real torture was the screens. West ran Frazier into massive picks set by Wilt Chamberlain over and over again. Frazier called it physically battering and mentally draining. Every screen forced Frazier into a split-second choice: go over the screen and stay close to contest the shot, but risk trailing the play or getting called for a foul, or go under the screen and put a body between himself and West, but concede the open jump shot. Against a shooter of West's caliber, going under was suicide. The mental load of navigating this labyrinth, anticipating the screen, calling out the switch, fighting through contact, knowing that a single error meant 2 points for the logo, defined defensive stress for Frazier. Their battles reached their peak in the NBA Finals. In 1970, the Knicks won in 7 games, but West averaged over 31 points per game. Frazier didn't stop West, he outlasted him. Frazier's legendary Game 7 performance, 36 points, 19 assists, 5 steals, was the ultimate response to West's dominance, but it came at a cost. In 1972, with Willis Reed injured, the Lakers defeated the Knicks. West finally got his ring. In 1973, the Knicks reclaimed the title, but West was still an all-star caliber threat, even in his final years. West played with desperate energy and extreme perfection. perfectionism. He treated every possession like life and death. Frazier played with detached efficiency. Facing West was a clash of temperaments. The exhaustion Frazier described was as much mental as physical. It was the strain of maintaining focus against someone who never let up, not for a second. At around 300 words in, I need to ask you something. Which of these matchups has surprised you the most so far? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe if you want more deep dives into basketball history like this one. Earl Monroe destroyed Frazier with chaos. Before they formed the Rolls-Royce backcourt as teammates, Monroe and Frazier were bitter rivals. Monroe played for the Baltimore Bullets and represented the antithesis of the structured style Frazier learned at Southern Illinois. Frazier's assessment of Monroe cuts to the core of his struggle. Earl didn't know what he was going to do. This reveals everything. Traditional defense relies on pattern recognition. Defenders study film to learn tendencies. He drives right. He spins left. He pulls up in transition. Monroe operated on pure improvisation. Observers compared his game to jazz improvisation, riffs and mid-flight changes that defied logic. Monroe's signature style involved a low, erratic dribble, spin moves in heavy traffic, and pump fakes that used his entire body. He was nicknamed Black Jesus on the playgrounds of Philadelphia for his miraculous ability to create something out of nothing. For a disciplined defender like Frazier, this unpredictability was infuriating. Frazier admitted he could play perfect defense, hand in Monroe's face all night, and Monroe would still score with a double pump scoop shot that looked physically impossible. Monroe disrupted Frazier's internal rhythm. Frazier wanted to anticipate. Monroe forced him to react. That split-second delay caused by processing Monroe's chaotic movement was all the space the Pearl needed. Frazier hated Monroe when they were both drafted in 1967 because of the immediate comparisons and the rivalry between the Knicks and Bullets. The Bullets defeated the Knicks in the 1971 Eastern Conference Finals, a series where Monroe's brilliance was on full display. This loss stung Frazier deeply. The ultimate validation of Monroe's difficulty as an opponent came when the Knicks traded for him in 1971. The Pearl joining Clyde created a redundancy on paper, two ball-dominant guards with conflicting styles, but Frazier's respect for Monroe's game allowed it to work. Frazier realized that having Monroe on his side meant he no longer had to chase the ghost. They won the 1973 championship together. For Frazier, the relief of not having to guard him anymore was priceless. Nate Archibald exposed Frazier with pure speed. As Frazier's career moved into the mid-70s, the NBA began to shift. The methodical half-court game of the 60s gave way to a faster, more open court style. The symbol of this new era was Tiny Archibald. Frazier admitted bluntly that Archibald was too quick. Frazier was a big guard at 6'4". He could out-muscle smaller players and use his length to recover if he got beaten. But Archibald, barely 6'1" and 150 pounds, possessed a velocity Frazier could not replicate. In the 1972-73 season, Archibald became the only player in NBA history to lead the league in both scoring, 34 points per game, and assists, 11.4 per game. Archibald attacked the rim relentlessly. He didn't probe the defense, he pierced it. He pushed the ball after made baskets, missed baskets, and turnovers. Frazier, who preferred a controlled tempo to set up the Knicks defense, was constantly forced into a track meet. The music of Archibald's game drove Frazier crazy, a reference to the relentless rhythm and pace Archibald imposed. Frazier's defensive safety net was his recovery ability. If an opponent got a half step, Frazier could use his size to contest the shot from behind or strip the ball. Against Archibald, a half step was a chasm. Once Archibald was past, he was gone. He could finish at the rim with acrobatic layups or dish to teammates before the defense could collapse. Frazier's admission that Archibald was too quick is significant because it's an admission of physical limitation. Against Robertson and Johnson, Frazier was outmuscled. Against West and Monroe, he was outwitted or outmaneuvered. But against Archibald, he was simply outrun. This marked the beginning of the end of big guard dominance. Frazier could feel the game evolving past him. Gus Johnson humbled Frazier before he ever reached the NBA. Johnson is the fifth member of Frazier's toughest list, but his impact traces back to college basketball in the mid-60s. Frazier played for Southern Illinois University and led them to an NIT title. Johnson played for the University of Idaho. Frazier credits Gus Johnson as the player who cooled him down. This phrasing is everything. Frazier, the cool one, meets the man who can extinguish his fire. It was rare for a collegiate forward to guard a point guard, but Idaho recognized Frazier's dominance and deployed Johnson, their best athlete, to stop him. Johnson was a precursor to the modern athletic forward. He was 6'6", 230 pounds, and possessed explosive leaping ability. He's famous for shattering backboards and dislocating shoulders with his dunks. Johnson used his immense frame to smother Frazier. He denied Frazier the ball, bumped him off his cuts, and physically intimidated him. For a young Frazier, Frazier, accustomed to being the best athlete on the floor, facing Johnson was a shock to the system. It was a lesson in the levels of physical dominance that existed in the world. Johnson's success foreshadowed a defensive tactic that would become common decades later, putting a big wing on a star point guard. By using Johnson, Idaho negated Frazier's size advantage over typical guards. Johnson could switch on to Frazier and stay in front of him, while also blocking his vision for passes. Johnson represents the ceiling of physical capability Frazier encountered. He was the one player who could make Frazier feel small. The cooling down wasn't just about points. It was about imposing humility through physical force. Johnson taught Frazier that no matter how skilled he became, there would always be someone bigger, stronger, and more explosive. What makes these 5 opponents so devastating is how each one attacked a different weakness. Robertson dismantled Frazier with strength, backing him down and erasing his hand speed through sheer physicality. West exploited Frazier's need for rhythm, using screens and his quick release to force constant mental calculations. Monroe destroyed pattern recognition, improvising in ways that made anticipation impossible. Archibald exposed lateral speed limitations, simply running past Frazier before he could react. Johnson imposed physical intimidation early, teaching Frazier that size and athleticism could neutralize skill. Together, they formed a complete blueprint for dismantling Walt Frazier's defensive equilibrium. The context of the era makes these battles even more brutal. There was no three-point line in the NBA until 1979, Frazier's final years. Without it, offensive spacing was compressed. All 10 players were often inside the 20-foot mark. This congestion made Frazier's job harder against slashers like Archibald and Monroe because there was no open space to recover into. West and Robertson were masters of the mid-range game. Frazier couldn't simply run them off the line. He had to contest shots in the 15 to 18-foot area, where screens and bodies were most dense. Frazier's persona of rockin' steady was a defense mechanism developed to survive these onslaughts. He wore the furs, the hats, the cool nickname as armor. On the court, he had to be a chameleon, adapting his defensive style to the specific threat of the night. But these 5 opponents forced him into the heat of battle, a place where his cool efficiency was tested to its absolute limit. But here's the truth that matters most. Frazier didn't just survive these battles, he absorbed the lessons. He integrated them into his game. The 1970 and 1973 championships weren't won in the absence of these challengers. They were won through the fiery crucible these players provided. Frazier learned to brace himself against Robertson's physicality and use his hands differently. He learned to navigate West's screens with better anticipation and communication. He learned to stay calm against Monroe's chaos and trust his instincts. He learned to push the pace against Archibald and beat him down the floor. He learned from Johnson that size could be overcome with intelligence and positioning. Greatness isn't defined by invulnerability. Frazier is a Hall of Famer and a top 75 player of all time, not because he shut these men down completely, but because he engaged them in the arena. These 5 players represented the jagged edges of the game that Frazier's smooth style couldn't easily polish. They were the grit in the gears of the Rolls-Royce. By studying how they exploited Frazier, we see him more clearly. A defensive genius who relied on wit, hands, and coolness, but who was mortal when faced with overwhelming strength, speed, or unpredictability. And yet he rose above it. He adapted, he survived, he won. So who do you think would challenge Frazier the most in today's NBA? Would it be someone with Robertson's strength, West's precision, Monroe's creativity, Archibald's speed, or Johnson's size? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this deep dive into basketball history, hit that like button and subscribe for more. Walt Frazier faced 5 players who exploited him, but in the end, they made him legendary.